For those of you who are from other colleges, I'm Lucy Dalglish. I'm the dean here of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. And I am joined by Jim Risen, a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner for the New York Times, the second one for revealing National Security Agency's secret eavesdropping program, which those of you who are about my age will remember pretty vividly, and those of you who were born in about 2001 may have heard about it. Jim has long covered what they call the alphabet agencies, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA. And I first got to know him from my former job at the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, when he was subpoenaed to testify in a criminal investigation against a former CIA employee by the name of Jeffrey Sterling. Jim had written a book called State of War, which revealed the CIA had botched a covert operation against Iran's nuclear program, among other things. Jim fought the subpoena for 7 or 8 years, but Sterling was ultimately tried and convicted, but without Jim's testimony, and someday that'll be a really interesting classroom discussion as well. I'll bring you in when I come back and teach media law. How's that sound?
Sure.
He left the New York Times and then went to work reporting for the nonprofit Intercept, owned by First Look Institute. And he also directed First Look Institute's Free Press Defense Fund. Among other things, Jim was the guardian angel who used the defense fund to pay for Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa's legal fight against the ongoing Philippine government investigation. In January, Merrill College very gratefully took custody of the defense fund as part of a generous gift from the First Look Institute. And we're delighted we also got Jim Risen in the bargain. And he will begin teaching the investigative reporting capstone in the fall of 2023. Was published yesterday. So we are among the first. Is this the first book party?
Yeah.
Wow. Yay. My former dean colleague at Columbia's journalism school, Steve Call, calls The Last Honest Man a ripping good read and a Washington thriller. Because it's hot off the presses, I'm still in the middle of the book, but it's fascinating. And I'm a baby boomer of an age that kind of remembers all of these characters and headlines. But The Last Honest Man is helping me form a narrative of the days in the late 60s and 1970s. So Jim, the first question, who was Democratic Senator Frank Church?
Well, Frank Church, I think, is one of the greatest Americans that is not well remembered. He's, which is one reason I wanted to write about him. I think people really should know more about him. He was a progressive liberal Democrat from Idaho, which sounds like an oxymoron today. He was actually the last Democrat elected to the Senate from Idaho. No one's ever been elected since then, except Republicans. And he was elected. He was born in the 1920s in Boise, and his really stood out from day one in his life. When he was in high school, he won the national debate competition set up by the American Legion, and went on to become one of the youngest senators in American history. He was elected to the Senate when he was 32, and he stayed in the Senate for 4 terms. And the reason he's best remembered is because of the Church Committee, which in the 1970s, 1975 and early 1976, investigated the CIA, and Church and the committee he ran conducted the very first investigation of the CIA ever. At the time, there were no congressional oversight committees. There was no oversight whatsoever of the CIA or the FBI or the NSA until Frank Church came along. And his committee conducted such an aggressive investigation that 3 of his witnesses were murdered. Both the CIA and the White House of Gerald Ford, who was president, tried to destroy Church and discredit him. but he fought back. And ultimately today, the reason he's important is that the Church Committee established rules for how the U.S. intelligence community should behave. The CIA and the FBI constantly violate those rules, but there are rules, and it was the first time there were ever any rules. There were no rules prior to 1975, and Frank Church created the rules of the road for U.S. intelligence.
Well, you said it probably didn't even occur to anyone that anybody would do anything like what they're doing, and that
Right.
he took on the national security state in a way that nobody had ever done before,
Right.
partly because nobody ever imagined that the CIA had moved from the old OSS intelligence agency analysis group
Right.
to this powerful weapon
Right.
that they used, that they wielded against U.S. citizens as well as people abroad.
Right. When the CIA was created in 1947, right after World War II, and it was originally designed to help the United States avoid another Pearl Harbor. One of the criticisms after the war was that the U.S. had ignored a lot of the evidence that they had already collected of what the Japanese were planning, and that if only we had a central place to put all the intelligence together and have good professional analysts who could look at all this stuff and be detached from the military, then they would have figured out what the Japanese were planning. And that was the original idea of the CIA. And very quickly after it was formed, it veered off from that very simple intelligence analysis function into covert action. And it was really because when Dwight Eisenhower became president 4 or 5 years after the creation of the CIA, he had commanded the army in World War II, and he never wanted another war he didn't want a war with the Soviet Union. And so he decided, without telling anybody, that I'm going to use the CIA as a weapon so that we can avoid a full war. And he began to turn the CIA, with the help of Allen Dulles, the CIA director, into this rogue weapon that overturned governments, staged coups, and did mind control drugs, all kinds of crazy stuff that nobody had anticipated.
When he was quite young, he's a World War II veteran. He was an Army intelligence officer in China.
Right.
Do you think that experience, I know in the book you talk about his thoughts about Chiang Kai-shek and what the government knew and what it didn't do, what it didn't know, and he came away with a really nasty feeling about that.
Right.
Did that influence what he did later in life?
Yeah, absolutely. He was an Army intelligence officer in China at the end of World War II, and he saw that the U.S. at the time was supporting the Chinese nationalist regime of Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist army in their fight against the Japanese. And he saw firsthand how corrupt and incompetent Chiang Kai-shek's government and army were. And that really impacted his thinking about the Vietnam War when the United States got involved in Vietnam in the early 1960s. He took his first trip as a senator to Vietnam in 1962. And to him, it was like deja vu all over again. The South Vietnamese looked just like the Chinese nationalist regime to him. It was a corrupt, incompetent, an army that was losing to insurgents. And he became one of the very first critics and opponents of the war in Congress.
Thereby driving other Democrats, like Lyndon Johnson.
Right.
He really ticked him off.
Yeah. He was very close friends with John Kennedy, and they had served together in the Senate. Kennedy actually came to Idaho in 1956 to campaign for Church when he was running the first time. And so when Kennedy was president, he was a little hesitant to go public with his criticism of Vietnam. But then when Johnson became president, he was much more vocal. And he pushed, Johnson really began to hate him because Church was the first major mainstream senator who people took seriously, who came to oppose the Vietnam War. There were a couple other fringe Democrats who they could ignore, who had opposed the war before Church. But then Church pushed for the first hearings on Vietnam in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He really pushed and pressured Senator William Fulbright to hold hearings. And that really led to the open display of opposition to the war for the first time in Washington. And it helped legitimize the anti-war movement.
So do you think that he actually had a role then in, and he found out much later, probably, that this sort of fomented the CIA spying on anti-war activists, college students, informers, and folks like that? Anybody at that time have ever imagined the CIA was doing something like that?
No, and that was one of the problems for Church, was that as he was becoming a more vocal critic of the Vietnam War, his criticism of the war led him to believe by the late 60s that the United States was becoming a militaristic empire. Mm-hmm. He thought Vietnam was a symptom rather than the cause of a deep-seated corrosion of the American Republic. But he didn't know just how bad the intelligence community was, because there was no oversight yet of the intelligence community. And as you said, the CIA began to conduct massive surveillance programs of the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. And the FBI was, doing a lot of the same kind of things.
Where did you get the idea for the title, The Last Honest Man? Where's that from?
Well, there was something that I read at Boise State University. Frank Church's papers are collected today. And I went out to Boise and I was going through old papers and I came across something that just fascinated me. And that was in 1956, when he ran for the Senate for the first time, he was running against a guy named Herman Welker, who was an old-line Republican who was Joseph McCarthy's biggest ally in the Senate. He was so close to McCarthy that his nickname was Little Joe from Idaho.
Oh, God.
And Welker had, in 1954, 2 years before Church ran against him, Welker blackmailed another senator, a Senator Lester Holt from Wyoming. Lester Holt was one of Joe McCarthy's biggest opponents in the Senate. And he was really beginning to lead the opposition to McCarthyism. And Welker went and found out that Holt's son had been arrested for homosexual solicitation in Washington, which was at the time a crime. And he then went to the DC police and said, if you don't fully prosecute Holt's son, I will bring you up for hearings in the Senate and destroy you, meaning the DC police. And then he went to Holt and said, if you don't quit the Senate now, I'm going to publicize what happened to your son all over Wyoming. And I'm going to prosecute him, make sure that the DC police prosecute him to the fullest extent. And Lester Holt then went to his office with a gun and shot himself. And Drew Pearson, the columnist, who was both a gossip columnist and an investigative reporter back then, before there was really much investigative reporting in Washington, wrote about this. But most of the rest of the Washington press corps was afraid to write about it because Welker threatened to sue for libel. And he then gave the eulogy at Holt's funeral. And he was running for re-election against Frank Church as if nothing had happened. And Church's staff, his campaign advisors, and some of his allies in the Democratic Party in Idaho put together a pamphlet listing all of this about Welker and many other things. He had also had ties to the New York mob, among many other problems. And the pamphlet was ready to go and be distributed in the fall of 1956 all over Idaho. And Church got a copy of the pamphlet and told his staff, "No, I want you to destroy this. I don't want this pamphlet to be distributed." And he ordered them all to be burned in a bonfire in the back of his campaign headquarters in Boise. Luckily, there was one left in the Frank Church papers, so I had a copy of it. And he said, I want to win on the issues, not through mudslinging. And I thought, there's no politician like that today.
No, you're right. There's not. I was throughout the book. There are descriptions of his personality, and I'm curious. Some people described him as incredibly articulate, with a presence when he spoke, and others called him a pretentious blowhard and publicity hound in love with his own voice.
Right.
And did those abilities both help and hurt him? Yeah,
I mean, that was the central tension in his life, was that he was radicalized by Vietnam by the 60s. He was, by the end of the 60s and early 70s, the most radical progressive senator in Washington. He was also a pretentious blowhard who wanted to be president. And those two parts of his personality were never really resolved. And it led that the consequence of that, I think, is the ultimate tragedy of his life, which was that he gave some of the most amazing speeches I've ever read in Washington. Speeches about, in the late 1960s, he was comparing, on the Senate floor, he was comparing the United States to the Soviet Union. He said, we were no better than Russia because of Vietnam. We are just as militaristic as the Soviets. And people were ignoring him because all they could think of was, oh, he's just a publicity hound. And it was almost as if the press didn't really read his speeches. Mm-hmm. And it's a real lesson for journalists today that we develop narratives about people without actually listening to them. I did go to YouTube and to see what clips I could find of him speaking. And I'm going to go back and I wasn't able to watch many of them. But he had, his problem really was the style of his speech more than the content. It was a very precise diction that he practiced from a young age. There's evidence that people who knew him when he was young, it was like he would, and his wife even would say this, he would stare in the mirror and speak and repeat things over and over and over again. And he had the most precise diction of anybody. His commander in the Army in World War II loved to listen to him speak so much that he had him come and perform speeches before other officers for dinner. And he said, you have the best diction in the Army. That's kind of weird. Yeah, it was very weird. And Church himself thought, I'm just like the court jester here in China. And so if you listen to him today, it's really hard to, he doesn't sound like a modern person. No. He sounds like something from 100 years ago. Yeah. And he sounds like an old, like what you imagine, Daniel Webster or somebody like that would sound like. I think that was what he was going for, really old-fashioned political speak. And it didn't work really in the 1960s for him. I mean, it was a problem that he couldn't understand why people didn't like the way he talked. And his nickname in the Senate was Senator Cathedral. Just like,
That's pretty good.
But the funny thing was he was saying the most radical things, the things that Bernie Sanders wouldn't dare to say today. So
talk about the church committee. And it wasn't just limited to one topic. I mean, they investigated a number of things.
Right.
What were a couple of the investigations that started out with IT&T, the international phone company?
Yeah, church was, if you don't mind a little backstory here, because it's fascinating journalistically. I interviewed Daniel Ellsberg quite a bit for my book. And Ellsberg talked about how before he took the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times, he took them to Senator William Fulbright, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And Fulbright promised him that he was going to hold hearings about the Pentagon Papers. And this is like 2 years before he went to the New York Times. And Fulbright then put them all in his safe at the Foreign Relations Committee and didn't do anything with them. And then the Pentagon Papers came out in the New York Times 2 years later, and he kind of had to make excuses for why he didn't do anything. In the meantime, another whistleblower came to him with documents about the CIA working with IT&T in Chile to overthrow the government of Salvador Allende. And he put those in the safe too. He didn't do anything with them. And he called the CIA director, Richard Helms, and said, is it true that you are involved in Chile? And he said, no, not at all. And he said, okay, that's good enough for me. And he sat on these documents, again, after sitting on the Pentagon Papers. And then when Jack Anderson, the columnist, he was Drew Pearson's successor, really, broke a big story about ITT funding the Nixon re-election campaign secretly in order to get an antitrust waiver for its acquisition of an insurance company. And suddenly, Fulbright realized, I've got all these ITT documents sitting in my safe. I'm going to look like an idiot if I sit on them just like I did with the Pentagon Papers again. And so he had one of his aides secretly go to Jack Anderson and give him all the documents. And Jack Anderson then broke the second big ITT story about its role in Chile with the CIA. And then Frank Church at the time was looking for something to do in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he read Jack Anderson's story and said, I think we should investigate ITT and the CIA in Chile. And Fulbright said, good idea. And then Church, they created a new subcommittee to investigate the CIA, and Church got all the documents from Anderson. And so they went from Fulbright to Anderson to Church. And it just shows you how Washington really works. And Mark over here wrote about this before I did, so in his book. In fact, you're the one who put me onto that, so thank you very much. Anybody who hasn't read his book, you really should read it. It's one of the best books about journalism in Washington. So anyway, that led to the creation of this subcommittee investigating multinationals and Chile and the CIA. And that was how, then Church went from that to running the Church Committee. And the Church Committee began to investigate all kinds of CIA operations and FBI and NSA operations. So it kind of was the stepping stone to the Church Committee. And
there's so many interesting side stories going on here, but one of them is one of his best friends as a young senator was John F. Kennedy.
Right.
And then through part of all of this process, they start investigating Kennedy's connections to the mafia.
Right.
And Judith Campbell Exner and all of that. Can you explain that for a minute?
Yeah, I mean, when Church began the Church Committee, it was January 1975, and it was right after Watergate And so he originally thought, this is going to be Watergate 2.0. We're going to find out all the abuses of the Nixon administration that haven't come out yet. And a lot of people at the time thought the CIA was deeply involved with Watergate. And as they began to get in to investigate the CIA, they found that a lot of its worst abuses happened way before the Nixon administration. And they found that the CIA had worked with the mafia in the late 50s and early 60s to try to kill Fidel Castro. And the focus of the investigation of the Church Committee at first became a focus on their efforts to assassinate foreign leaders, including Castro. And very quickly, they realized they had to investigate the Kennedy administration, which Frank Church had been very close to throughout the whole time period. And Ted Kennedy was still in the Senate at the time. And one of the things that they eventually uncovered was that John Kennedy, while he was president, had a mistress who was also at the same time the mistress of Sam Giancana, the mob boss of Chicago, who was involved with the CIA's plot to kill Castro. And when the Church Committee found out about her name was Judith Campbell, they had to decide, are we going to make this public or not? And what do we do with all this? And one of the funniest things that I found was that Church had a meeting of the Democratic caucus of the committee, and just the Democrats sitting there, and he said, okay, which one of you guys is going to tell Ted what we found? And Gary Hart, who's still alive, and I interviewed extensively, said, I'll do it. And so Gary Hart, who later, as you know, became a victim of his own issues, womanizing issues, went up to Ted Kennedy, I think on the floor of the Senate, and said, we've found this stuff about Judith Campbell. And he said that Kennedy looked at him like he knew exactly what he was talking about and said, thank you, and walked away. And then I interviewed Walter Mondale before he died last year, about a year ago. And he said, the funny thing is I went up to Ted on my own in the cloakroom, and I told him what we were finding, and he said, that was one of the most counterproductive conversations I've ever had. And what neither of them knew was there's a small passage in Judith Campbell's memoir where she talks about how before she started sleeping with John Kennedy, Ted Kennedy tried to sleep with her too. And so he knew all about this.
Well, the book opens with the scene at the Church Committee, and there's a very famous photo. I don't know if you can see it. I should have figured out how to blow it up.
Yeah.
Do you want to describe that photo?
Yeah, it was the first public hearing of the Church Committee in September 1975. There's a famous photo you may have seen. If you've ever seen any photos of Frank Church, you probably saw this one where he's holding up a CIA dart gun while he's questioning the CIA director. And there's a scene of him. It looks like a 45, but it's a customized weapon with that's a dart gun that shoots poisons. And it's probably the most famous image of Frank Church. So
he truly had some showman tendencies.
Yeah. That was the interesting thing. I think he was very he approached the Church Committee both as a serious investigation that appealed to him as understanding the role of the intelligence community in making America a militaristic empire that he wanted to rein in. At the same time, he thought, this is really good publicity for me I want to run for president. So he was split. And as a result, the press only saw him as a publicity hound. And I think that's it's a great lesson journalistically about what we miss when we
Focus on the shallow stuff.
yeah.
So what is the lasting impact, you think, of the church committee's work?
Today, the United States intelligence community is still governed by the rules imposed as a result of the church committee. The church committee created, as a result of the church committee, we have permanent intelligence oversight committees in the Senate and the House. Those did not exist prior to the church committee. The Senate Intelligence Committee was created about 2 months after the completion of the church committee's work, and it was its main recommendation. There was no House Intelligence Committee. There was no congressional oversight. And so congressional oversight exists today as a result of the church committee. But there are a number of other reforms. The FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is a deeply flawed law, but it governs eavesdropping by the government. That was passed and signed into law right after the church committee. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which bans bribery by American corporations over to foreign governments, was passed as a result of Church's investigation of ITT in Chile and Lockheed in Japan and elsewhere. There was a number of executive orders that were passed to rein in the CIA's activities that were passed directly as a result of the church committee. And the FBI imposed new guidelines for its activities right after the church committee.
Okay. So there is, early on in the book, there's sort of a passing reference to the influence Frank Church had on Joe Biden.
Yeah.
What are we seeing in Biden's behavior that would reflect Frank Church?
Biden was elected he was running for election in 1972 for the first time for the Senate from Delaware. And he was running against a hardcore Republican who was very close to Nixon, Richard Nixon. And he had been a very dependable vote in favor of the Vietnam War. And Nixon convinced the incumbent to continue to run again for re-election. And Church really wanted the Democrats to win that seat. And so he lent a number of his staffers to the Biden campaign in 1972, including his foreign policy advisors. And Biden began to take on Church's views on Vietnam pretty quickly. And then after Biden won the race, and his wife was killed, and his I guess his daughter was killed, and two of his boys were both injured. He was thinking about resigning before he actually took his seat. There's a lot of debate about how serious he was with whether he was really going to follow through with that or not. But Church then Church and Church's wife both went to visit Biden and tried to convince him to stay in the Senate, to take his seat. And he lent him a whole group of his aides to help him set up his office. And so there were other people in the Senate who convinced Biden to stay, but Church was one of the most critical, I think. And that led to one of the great disappointments and betrayals of Church's career was that in 1976, when he ran for president, Biden endorsed Jimmy Carter instead. So.
Wow. Well, Jim, you know an awful lot about the intelligence agencies, all these alphabets. You've researched and met many operatives on the record and off the record. What is it about what they do or could do that keeps you up at night?
That's a good question. Well, what I think they can do is pretty much whatever they want. And that's the scary part, is that up until 9/11, between the Church Committee and 9/11, there were real reforms and rules imposed on the intelligence community. And the generation of CIA officers who came after the Church Committee knew that the Church Committee had imposed a lot of limits on their ability to take action that were against the law. And after 9/11, and the Bush and Cheney really tried to relax a lot of those rules. And so we saw the CIA change into a targeted killing operation and basically an arm of the military in the war on terror. And that loosened a lot of the Church Committee rules. And so today, I think, I'm not sure that we have the level of oversight and the level of understanding of the rules that we had for at least one generation after the Church Committee.
Yeah. So you've been an investigative journalist. You've become a very good modern historian. Now you're a teacher.
Yeah.
What is it that you hope to accomplish here at Merrill College?
That's a really good question.
What have you found this? Have you found it to be interesting so far?
Oh yeah, it's great. It's great. I think that I've been, now that I've been a reporter for many years, way too many, and what I've learned recently, looking at the young journalists in newsrooms, both at the New York Times and now at The Intercept. Not to cast too many aspersions, but they don't get out of the office enough. And I want to help prod them to do that. I want to help them get out and interview people. And one of the things that, there's, I think, too much of a reliance on remote, thinking that you can do everything by email or text or DMing people. And so the focus that I want to bring is helping them learn the art of interviewing.
Well, the other thing is you learn faster than most reporters I know not to leave an electronic trail.
Yeah. And I think that's the key is there's a balancing act to how you interview people and how you get people to talk. And there's a lot of rules that that editors impose on reporters that reporters have to learn to ignore.
Okay.
In order to do their jobs properly. And one of them is don't become friends with sources, which was a rule written by somebody who's never developed a source, I think. I'd be happy to go into the rest in great detail in private.
Now we're going to turn it over to you. Does anyone have a question? But you haven't had a chance to read the book yet because it just came out. But yeah, Mark.
So when did you learn about journalism during all this?
That's a good, it's one of the humbling things about writing this book was to read the coverage of the Church Committee and Frank Church, and especially the Church Committee, to see how incremental the coverage was and how down in the weeds everyday stories are. And it makes you realize as a reader that we're not really serving the reader very well when we search for the new nugget of the day. I know that's a dynamic that's almost impossible to get rid of in daily journalism, but it's something that we really should be much more mindful of, because you could read, if you didn't already know a lot about the Church Committee and you just read these stories, you would have no idea what they were talking about. And, that's still true today, I think, in the press, is how incrementalism I think leads, eventually kind of makes so many readers, it turned off so many readers that they go for alternatives, that are not good, and that you're tempted as a consumer of news to go consume crap because it'll tell you what you want to hear rather than inform you. And I guess that's what I would come away with. It's humbling to go back and while you're researching history and learning, and by the time you're reading all the daily coverage, you know a lot about it. And then to see the coverage, you say, oh my God, they totally missed it.
Was there anyone who covered it that you thought might have done a good job?
Well, Cy Hirsch.
Cy Hirsch, I was just going to mention.
Cy Hirsch, the fascinating thing about the Church Committee was it was created because of Cy Hirsch's coverage in the New York Times of the CIA. In December 1974, Hirsch broke probably the biggest story of his life, domestic spying by the CIA of the intelligence community, of anti-war dissidents. And that led to Mike Mansfield, the Senate Majority Leader, creating what became the Church Committee to investigate the CIA. But then it was interesting, Hirsch was taken off once the Church Committee started, he was not assigned by the New York Times to cover it on a daily basis. And they had other people covering day-to-day stuff. I'm not sure Cy would have really temperamentally, I know him pretty well. He wouldn't have been good covering it anyway on a daily basis. But the coverage really suffered from people who were just looking for a quick fix.
Right.
There was an interesting New York Times Sunday magazine piece that came out like a year later that was supposed to be a retrospective on the Church Committee, and it completely missed the significance of it, and it basically took the CIA's point of view for, it obviously got leaks from people around the CIA saying, that the Church Committee was a total failure. Hmm. And there were quite a lot of journalism in the years immediately after the Church Committee that really dismissed the Church Committee as unimportant.
Well, Jerry.
Did you review television coverage of, the evening news broadcasts at the time? I'm curious about it.
To some degree, although it was really hard to get a lot of it. And tried to get CBS. They promised they would give me their full archives, and then they didn't. Which maybe I should have asked somebody else to help me, but YouTube has quite a bit. There was, it was similar to the daily news coverage. The New York Times probably has the best and most easily accessible database of old coverage. But if anybody hasn't used newspapers.com, I highly recommend that for research. It's really good also. To get other newspapers besides the New York Times. That was the nice thing, actually, from the last time I wrote a book to now, is having so much digital information, online digitally and available. It's amazing compared to just 5 or 10 years ago.
Yeah, you don't have boxes of stuff in your basement anymore, right?
Right. Although there was one, it was funny, you still have to do some of the old stuff. Like I had this one source who had worked for church, and he was a great source. And then in the middle of the pandemic, he died of COVID, and then his wife, about a couple months later, called me and said, "Well, Jerry, I was going through everything, and I found all these boxes that Jerry had, and he says, do you want them?" And included in these boxes was this guy's unpublished memoir of his work with Frank Church. And So it turned out to be a gold mine. So.
What, yeah, please.
Did your book cover his last Senate campaign with the anybody but church?
Yeah.
The thing with the time zone.
Yeah. That was it was interesting. There's for those of you who don't know, Church ran for president in 1976 and got beat by Jimmy Carter, but he stayed in the Senate and became chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And then in 1980, he had to run for re-election, and that was the year Ronald Reagan was running for president against Jimmy Carter. And he got destroyed by Reagan. Carter got destroyed by Reagan, and but Church was running very evenly against a guy named Steve Sims, and Idaho is a very peculiar geography, in which the northern Idaho is a panhandle, even though it's about the same. Was it latitude, longitude, whatever,
Longitude.
up and down. As southern Idaho, it's in the western time zone instead of the mountain time zone. And North Idaho today, which is probably the most conservative part of America, around Coeur d'Alene and that area, is it's like Waco land. I mean, it's like militia land. But back then, it was a Democratic stronghold. It was probably the most heavily Democratic part of Idaho at the time, because it was all miners and union workers and everything. Anyway, Jimmy Carter conceded at about 8 p.m. on the night of the election in the East. And the polls were still open in North Idaho at the time, and Church and a lot of Democrats now believe that the turnout declined immediately after that, and Frank Church lost by 4,000 votes.
Wow.
So, and so the people in Idaho are still pissed.
There,
Yeah.
Hi, I have a question about the CIA.
Yeah.
And so from the research that you've done, can you please talk about what you found out about the CIA's involvement in weakening and destabilizing liberation movements, particularly like the shooting of Bob Marley or even the murdering of Patrice Lumumba in Congo?
Yeah, I have a whole big section of the book about the Lumumba case. In their first, as I said, their first big investigation of the Church Committee was to investigate CIA plots to kill foreign leaders. And one of them was Patrice Lumumba, who was just been elected leader in Congo. And first, the CIA, this was under the Eisenhower administration at the time, right before the Kennedy administration came in. And Lumumba was kind of an independence leader who was fighting against the Belgian efforts to rein in the independence movement. It's a very convoluted time framed as you go through it. Lumumba became leader, and then almost immediately the CIA and the Belgian government and the mining interests that controlled most of Congo all conspired to stage a coup d'etat. And then Lumumba was, the United Nations sent peacekeepers into Congo at the time, and it was unclear whether they were there to help the coup plotters or protect Lumumba. And Lumumba was kept in a house arrest. He was kept in safekeeping, but was really a house arrest by the United Nations peacekeepers inside what was then called Leopoldville. And so the CIA began to plot how can we get past United Nations peacekeepers to kill Lumumba? Which is one of the most bizarre things the CIA ever did. And so they brought in hitmen to try to figure out how to get past the UN peacekeeping troops, which it wasn't clear entirely that the UN peacekeeping troops wanted to stop them from killing him, but they were there in between them. And then there was also efforts by the CIA to poison Lumumba. They brought a CIA expert on poisons, came to Congo to and gave the poisons to the CIA station chief, who years later testified before the Church Committee and claimed, I threw all the poisons in the river, which it's not clear he really did. In any event, Lumumba then begins to fear for his life, and he tries to get away and get back to what was then called Elizabethville, to his, in eastern Congo, to his, kind of his stronghold. And the CIA helped the Belgians and the Congo forces of that were opposed to, that were loyal to the Belgians and opposed to Lumumba, to capture him. And he was taken to the separatist area, Katanga, where he was murdered immediately, and then his body was dissolved in acid. And his body was never found. And it wasn't until about 2001 or 2002 that Belgians finally admitted that they were responsible for his killing, along with Katanga. Was basically a mining area that separated at the behest of the Belgians. So I've got a lot about that in the book.
Right. Anyone else? Other?
Yeah, I'm sorry, what was your name?
Hi, I'm Tinashe. I am a grad student here, but I will be gone in a week. I graduate.
Oh, well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Deneen.
I have kind of two questions that are related. I was just in Maryland recently. I was in Maryland recently and I saw the hotel where Fidel Castro was invited to Harlem when he came to the UN. People in New York did not want him staying at the hotels in Manhattan, so he went to Harlem to stay. And there he met with Malcolm X.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's interesting.
Oh, I thought you might know. And then I wondered whether that might have things to do with the assassination of Malcolm X, and whether you knew whether the CIA was involved in the killing of Malcolm X.
Oh, there's no evidence that I know of that they were involved with Malcolm X's killing. But they were involved in trying to get rid of Castro right away. I don't think it was because he met with Malcolm X. They were trying to get him from the get-go. It was first the Eisenhower, it started with the Eisenhower administration and then continued with the Kennedy administration and then even continued with the Johnson administration. They had a lot of very incompetent killers and they never were able to kill Castro.
So given what you found about the CIA's actions in liberation movements and other third world countries and assassinations of world leaders, do you think there should be some restorative justice paid to these countries or the people that are left there having their leaders assassinated by mafia?
Yeah, I think I do. I think the problem is that we are facing a backlash ever since, really, for our actions around the world. Vietnam was just one example. Cuba, we still haven't resolved that. Chile, I mean, we never have addressed the horrific consequences of what we did with Allende and leading to Pinochet. In Congo, I mean, all around the world, we have never been held to account for what we have done. I'm not sure how how we can do that. I mean, that you saw every once in a while you see efforts to do that, but it never goes anywhere. To me, probably the worst thing, this is the one that really haunts me, is their efforts, this is just my pet peeve, was in Chile. There was a general, I don't know if you know this story, but there was a general named Rene Schneider. He was the general, he was the head of the army, he was the chief of staff of the Chilean army when Salvador Allende was elected president of Chile, and was, while Allende was going through the process of becoming president, they had a certification vote in the Chilean Congress, which, if this sounds familiar, and the CIA wanted to stop the certification vote in Congress, which may ring some bells. And one of the problems the CIA faced was that the Chilean army was not in favor of a coup d'etat against Allende. They believed in the Constitution. And Schneider was, the chief of staff, was a constitutionalist. He believed that the rule of law should be upheld and that Allende should become president. And so the CIA said, well, he believes in the Constitution and the rule of law, so we got to get rid of him. And they started plotting to kidnap Schneider with some people in Chile. And one of the groups that they plotted with tried to kidnap him and then killed him in the midst of the kidnapping. And the CIA ever since said, well, we didn't kill him. We were just trying to kidnap him. And it was because he believed in the rule of law. And I always thought that was got to be like one of the worst things they ever did.
Thanks, Jim. We've got some refreshments for you, and Jim is going to sign books if you'd like him to do so. And thank you to everyone who came out this afternoon.
Thanks very much. That was great.